Okay, hello everyone. Good afternoon and assalamu alaikum. I am Dr. Tehseen Zahra, coordinator Corpus Research Center and managing editor, Corporum Journal of Corpus Linguistics from Air University. We have participants from Malaysia, Pakistan, Oman, Afghanistan, China, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and many other countries of the world. I welcome you all in the second webinar of Corpus Research Center. And thank you so much for your participation, and thank you so much for your overwhelming response.
So, hello everyone. This is Dr. Akhtar Abbas from Corpus Research Center, Faculty of Social Sciences, Air University. Before the formal start of the session, I'm pleased to share with you all that we have our Vice Chancellor of Air University, Marshal Javed Ahmed, with us. May I request you, sir, to address the audience, please?
Thank you very much, Dr. Akhtar, once again. And there's a slight echo in your sound system. I hope you can get it checked up and rectified. Dear participants, Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon from Pakistan. I know it will be good morning for Professor Paul, and for our participants in the East, it will be good evening. Now, this is the beauty of what happens online. Something which we have perfected in the COVID scenario. So I welcome all of you to the second Corpus Research Center webinar and wish you happy learning. I'm very obliged and thankful to the learned Professor Paul Baker, who's an expert on the subject, for sparing his time for the webinar. We keenly look forward to your talk, and I'm sure it'll be a very good source of learning for over 900 participants we have online today. So it's a very good audience. I also appreciate the Dean Faculty of Social Sciences, Professor Munawar, and his team at the Corpus Research Center for arranging this very useful activity. Now, corpus linguistic studies have transformed over the years. And if you look at the different generations of corpora, from the early works in the 50s to the influence of now computer technologies and artificial intelligence coming in to sift first kilobytes of data and then megabytes and then terabytes of data. So there's a lot of data, and I think computing in these times is also changing the way we look at our research. From the Air University's perspective, the challenge to language education posed by COVID-19, it pointed to a collaborative effort with a lot of universities abroad. And from that perspective, I thank Professor Paul once again, where we've been able to connect with him. I think during these environments, when the COVID situation is uncertain, it provides a very good learning opportunity to all our students. If I say in terms of significance, the field of knowledge has a very large potential to address social issues embedded in the language. If we look at the Corpus Center at Lancaster University is one example of how much work has been done on this particular subject. And Professor Baker's contribution in this regard is very significant in the field. I've gone through some of the works which he's done. I think that he's an expert on this subject. Now, at the Air University, we are very keen to build sustainable academic and social nexus at national and international universities. So we would be very keen to collaborate with Professor Baker and his department so that our own Corpus Center also progresses. Now in Pakistan, there are above 70 to 80 languages which we speak. So from the Air University's perspective, for us, it's a very important subject. Now let me thank Professor Paul once again. We look forward to a very interesting talk today. And I hope all our audience all around the world will enjoy today's talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. You're always very encouraging and motivating for all of us here at our university. May I request Dean Faculty of Social Sciences, Professor Munawar Iqbal Ahmed, to address the participants of today's webinar.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you very much, Dr. Akhtar, for giving me this very important opportunity to talk to the audience from across the globe. To begin with, I would say Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon to all the participants, dear Vice Chancellor and Mr. Paul Baker. Today is a very important day for the Corpus Center and as well as for faculty of social sciences, because we are going to have a very useful and very productive session in terms of academic activity and research-based scholarly discussion by Paul Baker. So I would like to welcome Paul Baker, and this the number of participants, the overwhelming number of participants, is a testimony to the scholarly eminence and the acknowledgement in the academia that Paul Baker is a popular scholar in the field, and everyone around the world is very keen to listen to him. Of course, this overwhelming participation from across the world is something unusual, and it's mainly because of Paul Baker. So I would like to congratulate you, Professor Baker, for this eminent position. I would also like to welcome the participants from across the globe, because I know that there are people in addition to Pakistan. The participants are mainly from Turkey, from Indonesia, from Malaysia, from Philippines, from UK, from USA, from China, from India, and to name, any country, and we have participants in this very important webinar. I also congratulate team of CRC, our Corpus Center, for organizing such a useful debate and such a useful webinar. There's a lot of work, a lot of hard work, which has gone into the organizing of this type of activity. The Corpus Center at the Department of English and in the Faculty of Social Sciences is engaged in addressing local and global issues of a wide range related to language endangerment, language management, language planning, language policy, and translation through diverse type of activities, like in terms of teaching, trainings, workshops, webinars, and these other research activities in the field of language studies. Now, today's corpus-based analysis, discourse analysis, is significant in terms of its relevance to the research and to the studies going on in different parts of the world. And corpus-based and corpus-driven discourse analyses have significantly contributed into the field of discourse studies. And this webinar, that is corpus-based discourse analysis, hopefully would offer significant insights of viewing the world through various discursive practices. This is also interesting, as mentioned in the abstract sent to us by Professor Baker, that corpus-based discourse analysis is instrumental to look into the ways of viewing the world that are linked to attitudes, representations, and arguments. Once again, I am thankful to Professor Paul Baker and all other participants. I wish you a very productive, very useful afternoon and a very good debate. I am proud that Department of English and our CRC is able to organize such a useful workshop, webinar, and I wish you very happy learning, all participants. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Paul. Hope you are doing well. Now we will start our session formally. Professor Paul Baker is a renowned corpus linguist. His research interests are corpus linguistics, obviously language and identities, and critical discourse analysis. Moreover, he is a commissioning editor of journal Corpora. So the total duration of this webinar is 1 hour, and that leads to a question answer session. Initially, we'll listen to Paul, and after that, we will send our questions to Paul, and he will answer you the questions that would send to us. Thank you. Over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sassine, and thank you so much for inviting me. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
That's great. There's no echo. That's wonderful. Thank you. I'd also like to thank the Vice Chancellor and the Dean for the kind words that they said and for introducing me. That's very, very kind and unexpected. And also thank you, all of you, for attending. It's wonderful that so many of you have come to hear me talk. Shall I share my screen? Is that possible that I can do that? Do I have the permissions to share?
Yes, Paul, we can see your screen now.
Great.
Okay, your screen is visible now.
Great. Okay, that's wonderful. So this is the talk about corpus-based discourse analysis. It's something that I've been doing quite a while now, for about 15 years. I've used corpora, which are large collections of naturally occurring texts, to analyze discourses. And I've used a wide range of corpora in my analyses, ranging from written data, like newspapers and health leaflets, to spoken data, looking at television sitcoms and government debates. My research has been mainly focused around discourses of different identity groups. So I've looked at groups that relate to gender and sexuality, such as feminists and trans people. But I've also looked at groups that relate to religion, ethnicity, and social class. So I've looked at Muslims, immigrants, and people on benefits. And during this talk, I'm going to draw on various examples from this body of research, including 2 projects which I've published as books just this month. I didn't write them both at the same time, but there was a bit of a delay in one of them coming out, so they both came out in the same month. Now, I do have a warning. Social research can deal with very challenging topics at times, and a couple of the examples that I'm going to talk about today involve these kind of challenging topics. So one is going to be looking at hate speech, and another one is going to be looking at sex and relationships. So that just is a kind of content warning. And if you're kind of worried that you may be offended, then I won't be offended if you decide to leave halfway through. So what do I mean by discourse? It's a term which has a range of different meanings depending on who you talk to. Here I'm taking it to relate to ways of representing the world after Foucault. And I have a nice quote by Vivian Burr, who describes a discourse as a set of meanings, metaphors, representations, images, stories, and statements that in some way produce a particular version of events. And surrounding one object or event, or etc., there may be a variety of different discourses, each with a different story to tell about the world, a different way of representing it to the world. So this view of discourse is very much linked to the idea of ideology and attitudes. And there's a view that language helps to construct a discourse or a different version of reality. And these different discourses are always going to be kind of clashing against each other, each one vying for domination. And one popular form of analysis which concentrates on discourse is called critical discourse analysis, or CDA. So CDA views language as social practice, and it's interested in how ideologies and power relationships are expressed in language and in texts. So a CDA analysis would involve a combination of different approaches. So they may start by doing a linguistic analysis of a text, of words on a page, but they may also consider relationships between texts. So they may look at things like intertextuality and interdiscursivity. And I'll talk a bit about intertextuality towards the end of my talk. They may also be interested in knowing about the conditions of production and reception around the creation of the text. So who produced the text and why did they produce it? And also how was it received? Who was it aimed for? What sort of people read it? And what did they think about the text? As well as this, CDA looks at the wider context in which the text was produced. So it looks at what was happening in a particular society when the text was produced, what relevant events in the past led up to that point, what was the political or social or economic context that was happening when that text was produced. Now, this is all quite a lot to do for an analyst and requires quite a lot of different skills. And the potential criticism of CDA is that it only means we can actually look at a small number of texts in any detail. But then there's a problem, because that means maybe we've just picked our texts because they help to prove a preconceived point. So maybe we ignore lots of texts that sort of don't fit in with our hypotheses, and we only cherry pick the ones which do. So this is where a corpus approach can come in, and it helps to counter that criticism. If we collect a corpus with hundreds of thousands of texts in it, then we have better evidence that any linguistic patterns we find are going to be representative of the overall pattern of discourse. And if you're looking at how a subject is constructed in the discourse, you're not likely to get a lot of cases of what you're looking for from just a single text. And one of the arguments about discourses is that the more often we encounter them, the more powerful they are. So Norman Fairclough says, a single text on its own is quite insignificant. The effects of media power are cumulative, working through repetition of particular ways of handling causality and agency, particular ways of positioning the reader, and so forth. Michael Stubbs says, repeated patterns show that evaluative meanings are not merely personal and idiosyncratic, but widely shared in a discourse community. A word, phrase, or construction may trigger a cultural stereotype. So a corpus-based approach lets us investigate this cumulative, repetitive nature of discourse and ideology. And an example of something on its own may not suggest very much to us, but if we see it being constructed over and over again in the same way, it gives us evidence that this is a common sense way of looking at the world of discourse. Also, the nice thing about having lots of data is we may be able to find some examples of quite rare discourses, which probably would never occur at all if we just looked at a small number of texts. And the research that I'm going to talk about today comes under the heading of CADS, or Corpus-Assisted Discourse Studies. Now, this was a field that emerged in the early 2000s. The term CADS was invented by Alan Partington. And Partington says, the aim of CADS is to uncover in a discourse type under investigation what we might call non-obvious meaning. So that is meaning which might not be readily available to perusal by the naked eye. And this idea of non-obvious meaning is central to CADS, because we don't want to just use our techniques to tell people what they already know, what would be called a so what finding. However, it can sometimes, I think, be a bit difficult to work out in advance what people already know. And even if we do tell people a so what finding, the corpus techniques can still be quite helpful. They can provide exact quantifications in terms of the frequencies of linguistic features, which people may only have a vague impression about. Now, Partington describes CADS as not being tied to any school of discourse analysis, so it's not the same as CDA. In fact, he distinguishes CADS from CDA in saying that CADS does not have an overarching political agenda. I think, though, with that said, some people who do CADS research are approaching the topic because they feel maybe there's some kind of bias or unfairness or inequality around the topic and the discourse around it. And they want to highlight that, to note it, and they hope that there will be social change for the better as a result of that. And I think it's okay if you want to do that, but it's important that we shouldn't make our corpus analysis fit into our preconceived ideas or theories or hypotheses about bias. Instead, I'd recommend trying to bear in mind Jeffrey Leach's idea of the principle of total accountability. So corpus linguistics tries to account for all cases, even those which go against what we're expecting or hoping to find. Now, the analysis that I do usually have several stages to them, although it can be the case that you can move forwards and backwards between these stages rather than just being a linear progression. So stage one is descriptive. I would use corpus techniques to identify linguistic patterns in corpora. I would look, say, for what words are keywords, and maybe then look at words that collocate with one another. And I'll talk about keywords and collocates in a couple of my case studies a bit later. In stage two, we have to interpret those patterns, though. So we need to ask how these patterns contribute towards the realization of different discourses. We may try to group different patterns together, or think about the effects that these patterns might have on readers. Thirdly, we need to explain these patterns. And this is often where we need to put the corpus aside and step away from it to think about the various contexts that are relevant. We may want to consider the legal status of the group that we're examining if we're looking at a social group. We may want to look at opinion polls, or maybe laws about what's allowed to get written or what gets censored in society that produce the texts. And finally, we have an evaluation stage, where we may want to ask who benefits from what we found in the texts and the discourses that we found in there. And should we make any recommendations that maybe there should be changes in society or the ways that certain groups are represented? Now, often this last stage can very much depend on the values or the political stance of the analyst. And not everybody wants to engage in that final stage. And I think that's okay, but it really depends upon how critical you want your discourse analysis to be. So I now want to move on to give some examples of how this could all work in practice and also illustrate some of the corpus-based techniques I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to start with an example that uses the concept of collocation as a basis. So collocates are words which co-occur with each other, much more often than we would expect by chance alone. And they enable us to identify salient lexical patterns of association without having to read through hundreds of citations of a word. Instead, they give us a kind of brief summary of the lexical context that a word occurs in. They're very useful to discourse analysts because they help to reveal ideological associations between two words. So another quote from Stubbs, he points out that words occur in characteristic collocations, which show the associations and connotations they have and the assumptions that they embody. And I'll just give one of Stubbs' examples here, which is the collocational relationship between the word illegal and immigrant, which often occur in that phrase, illegal immigrant. So there's a theory relating to this called lexical priming, which hypothesizes that if we see two words together, then on the occasions where we see one of the words, our brains will get primed to think of the second word. So if we read or hear the phrase illegal immigrant over and over again, maybe we hear it in a certain newspaper or a certain news TV channel, or we have a group of friends who use that phrase a lot, or we go on a website forum where it gets used a lot, then that's going to create an association between those two concepts. And then later on, maybe one day, we see the word immigrant all by itself, but we may be primed to think of the word illegal because of all of the previous cases where we've seen those two words together. So immigrant kind of picks up the connotation of illegality, even maybe if it's not made explicit. And Stubbs says, if collocations and fixed phrases are repeatedly used as unanalyzed units in media discussion and elsewhere, then it's very plausible that people will come to think about things in such terms. So as an example of how we can use collocates in discourse analysis, I want to talk about some research that came out in the book that was published last month, that I published with Rochelle Vesey and Tony McHenry. So this is one of the challenging texts that I warned you about at the start. And this was actually probably the most challenging piece of research I've ever had to do in many ways. It involved the corpus analysis of a set of online texts that were found on the hard drives of people who were convicted of terrorism offences in the UK. And people at in the British government, in Parliament, in the Home Office and the police got in touch with myself and other colleagues at Lancaster University and asked us if we would help them to analyse these texts to make sense of them. So these texts are actually illegal to possess in the UK, and if you're found to have them on your computer, you can actually go to prison. So we had to go through quite a lot of background checking ourselves in order to get these texts, and we had to promise that we wouldn't share them with anybody. And I remember when we had meetings about these texts, we had to have them in sort of locked rooms, and we had to give our mobile phones away so we couldn't record anything. It was all very top secret and quite challenging. And the texts themselves are actually very challenging to read, and also thinking about the context in which they occurred, where people had died, was also quite challenging to do. So all of these texts had been found on these hard drives of people who'd been convicted of terrorism, and they all related to Islam in some way. Before we got the text, they'd been classified into 3 categories by a religious expert who wasn't a linguist, a man called Donald Holbrook. And what he did was he read the texts and he just noted their content and the overall message and attitudes in them, and then gave them a classification. But he's not a linguist, so he didn't use sort of any linguistic analysis really. It was more kind of content analysis. So he classified them into 3 types: extreme, fringe, and moderate. So the extreme ones are texts which endorse violence in contemporary contexts, and they involve stark dehumanization of people. The second text type are called fringe texts, and they are politically radical and confrontational. They express hostility towards people, but they recommend more of an isolationist approach. So they say, you know, you shouldn't mix with certain types of people rather than trying to kill them or hurt them. And then the moderate texts just contain more general material, news commentary, where there's no endorsement of violence or hatred. The sizes of these sets of texts are quite different. The extreme and moderate texts, we had about 1.7 million words. With the fringe ones, there's a bit less, just under 500,000 words. So I've had to work with relative frequencies because the actual sizes of the text are so different. And when I talk about frequencies, I'll talk about them in terms of per 100,000 words in order to compare across the three types. And we had some various questions to consider here. You know, how do these texts differ from each other, particularly to the extent of which, how does the fringe text maybe get across, you know, a kind of more violent message? Or does the fringe text act as a kind of halfway house, a kind of way stage between the moderate and the extreme? And also, how do the writers of these texts help to legitimate violence towards other people? So to illustrate the analysis, I want to look at just one word, and that's the word America. Now, I've chosen this word to talk about because it was the most frequently mentioned country in the extreme corpus. And it was also a keyword in the extreme corpus. It was much less common in the moderate and fringe texts. I think there were only 52 mentions of it in the fringe texts, but we have 1,711 mentions of America in the extreme. Now, although America literally refers to a country, when we look at how it was used in these texts, it's actually more likely to refer to a social actor rather than the geographic region. And this is a case of what Van Leeuwen refers to as spatialization. And just to sort of show how this works, I took a random sample of 100 cases of America from all the texts, and then I looked at each of them, and I found that 77 of them refer to America as a social actor. And most often the social actor is the American government. Now, I just put two examples there, one from the moderate text and one from the extreme text, just so you get a sense of how different writers refer to the American government. So in the moderate texts, we're more likely to see this as a kind of online explicit reference to the American government. And it's described there as scrambling to pursue a war. But in the extreme text, we have reference to America, which has declared war. It's not the American government, it's just America. And this is an important distinction because it means that America becomes a much more vague social actor. We're not really sure who America is referring to. Is it the country? Is it the culture? Is it the government? Is it everybody in America who's kind of behind this? So it becomes a bit more difficult to make a distinction between the actions of a country's government and the citizens of that country if we just refer to America. Everything kind of gets lumped in together, and that's important ideologically. Now, in terms of how I carried out this analysis, I used an online corpus analysis tool. I recommend this one to use. You have to subscribe to it, but you can, I think, get a trial period, I think, for about 30 days. And this is called Sketch Engine. It's nice because it has lots of very large corpora you can use yourself that have already been uploaded there. But you can also upload your own corpora to it. And it does grammatical tagging of your corpora automatically, which is wonderful. It also has a function called Word Sketch, which lets you type a word into a search box, and then it gives you a list of all of the words which co-occur or collocate with that word. And helpfully, it groups those collocates for you according to the grammatical relationships that occur with the word you're searching on, which saves a lot of time, especially if you're looking at lots of words and you're looking at trying to compare lots of corpora together. So using the word sketch, I was able to get a sense of different representations around these words I was interested in, and also to quantify these representations by taking account of how often they occurred. And then I was able to compare the representations across the fringe, extreme, and moderate texts to get a sense of which were most typical for each text type. And overall, there were 5 representations of America that I found, all of which were most common in the extreme texts. So I'll just go through these, and then I'll show you at the end the bar chart, which allows you to compare the frequencies of each one. So here's the first one. Now, this was an interesting one I wasn't expecting to find at all. And that's one of the nice things about a corpus approach, and that it often tells you things you would never think to look at yourself. So this involves America collocating with the pronouns her, herself, and she. But there weren't an enormous number of cases, only 34 cases of this occurring in the extreme data, but it never occurred in the fringe text and only 3 times in the moderate. Now, America was never referred to with male pronouns, only female ones, which makes this quite interesting. And I thought, well, maybe this is just something where, you know, it happens in language. We refer to countries with female pronouns. So I went to another corpus, the British National Corpus, and I looked at lots of different countries, and then I looked at what pronouns collocate with them. And actually, I did find about 100 cases in the BNC of other countries being referred to as female, particularly in historical and political texts. So it is something which does happen. But what's interesting about it here is that although the extreme texts mention lots of other countries, they only used female pronouns on America. They never used it on other countries. So there was something interesting and quite special happening here with America. And I was thinking, why are they referring to it so much as a woman? I'll come back to this a bit later on and talk about some of the representations first, and maybe it will become a bit more explanatory. So here's the second representation. And this is the sense that America has a powerful military. So when America is the agent, it collocates with verbs like invade, kill, attack, perpetrate, etc. There's also reference to America possessing a war machine, an air force, having a campaign and having defenses. There's references to the weaponry, the force, and the crusaders of America. So this is a representation which, on the one hand, views America as strong, but it's also quite a negative one because it focuses on America doing quite aggressive things. And one of the most interesting collocational relationships here is between America and the word crusaders. And I've given an example of how this occurs in one of the texts here, talking about Faisal Muhammad carried the banner and his dagger to spear the Crusaders of America on 4th of November 2015, spilling their filthy blood in their insecure homeland. Now, crusader is a word which historically refers to Christian soldiers who carried out crusades between 1095 and 1492. And it's interesting then to cast modern day Americans as crusaders. It makes a kind of association between medieval soldiers and modern Western citizens viewing the present day through the lens of the past. And I think that also helps to legitimate this violence, having this kind of historical association of the present with the past. Now, related representation is one which views America as something of a manipulative bully. In terms of verbs, America is described as conning, dazzling, oppressing, and controlling other social actors. There are references to people being in the fear of America, the slave of America, or its puppet or victim. America is described as a bully, an aggressor, and an enemy. And there are references to America's atrocities, its arrogance, its boasts, and its evil. So this is probably a more negative representation than the one that just talks about America as having this powerful military. There's a sense here that America is not moral, it's not playing by the rules, it's not being fair. And as with the reference to Crusader in the previous slide, here we see more references to America's past, and this time America's racism. The example here talks about America as a land of slavery, segregation, of lynching, and the Ku Klux Klan. So these historical associations are extended, again justifying hatred of today's Americans. And an even more negative representation perhaps indicates that America is hated and should be attacked. So here's where we find this dehumanizing language that Donald Holbrook mentioned earlier on. We're seeing America associated quite often with animals, these kind of metaphors. So we've got kind of a pun here, a reference to the United Snakes of America. A reference to the dragon, the reptile of the sea, which is America. Americans are described as brothers of monkeys and pigs. And then we've got another metaphor about a sort of a disease metaphor. America is a cancer that needs to be removed. So by dehumanizing America, it makes it easy to carry out violence on the human beings, on the citizens of it. But interestingly, there's another aspect of this representation which actually humanizes America rather than dehumanizes it. So here we find metaphors where we're told of the mask behind America's ugly face. There are threats to decapitate America from the rest of the world, kind of to cut off its head. or to bleed America to the point of bankruptcy. So there's quite a lot going on here ideologically. America is being humanized, so the authors are making it clear that they're not just talking about a geographical region, but they're talking about an actual social actor. But then because America is standing for ordinary Americans, then it also needs to be dehumanized, so the violence can be justified more easily. It's easier to attack people if you don't view them as people, but you view them as snakes or monkeys or dragons or a cancer. And here's the final representation. This is looking at America, getting quite negative, but this time is weak and failing, which is quite different from those earlier representations where America was seen as having this very strong military presence. So this representation is saying America, we've seen the beginning of America's demise, America's star is waning, America is weak. And I think it also helps to explain the representation of America as female, which I mentioned earlier on. I think the authors of these texts want to kind of construct America as vulnerable and weak. And I think positioning it as female, which is maybe stereotypically in a sexist way, seen as the weaker sex or the fairer sex, I think is one way that they do this. And I think they're kind of trying to balance here, two ways of representing. If they view America as too powerful, then maybe there's no point in attacking it because it will always win. If they view it as too weak, then there's no point in attacking it because it's going to destroy itself anyway. So they've got to kind of have a bit of a balance and do a bit of both. And I think that last example kind of combines those two representations together. So it's saying, no matter the level that America's strength reaches, there is a Lord stronger than it, and he will defeat it in the end. So it's saying, even though America's strong, it will still get defeated. So this bar chart shows the frequencies of these 5 representations. The dark bars are for the extreme, the light grey ones, the middle grey ones are fringe, and then the lighter grey ones are moderate. So it's basically counting up the occurrences of all of the different collocational patterns that I found that represented these different representations, and then putting them in this bar chart. And you can see that the most common one is in the extreme. It's America has been hated and attacked. The fringe barely has any representations. The moderate one also has America has been hated, attacked, and also has America as having quite a powerful military. But you can see that the extreme focus more on America as a bully and America as female and weak and losing. That's a much more extreme representation. We're not really seeing that in fringe and moderate. So the analysis here is helpful, I think, using this sketch engine and this method, because we can identify these representations, we can then quantify them, and then we can do comparisons across the different text types in order to see which ones are the most frequent. Okay, let's look at another example. And I've mentioned keywords a couple of times so far, so I want to explain what they are a little bit and talk about them in a bit more detail. So a keyword is a word which occurs statistically more often in one corpus when compared against another corpus. So to get keywords, you need to have 2 corpora to compare against each other. And keywords are useful for discourse analysis as they can act as signposts. They give us a focus or a way into a corpus. Sometimes we don't expect the word to appear as a keyword and we don't know why it's there, so then we have to examine it in detail to understand what's happening with it and explain it. So by themselves, keywords don't tell us very much, and if we try to guess at what's happening with them, sometimes we can make mistakes, as I've found myself several times. So we have to do a much more detailed analysis, looking at concordance lines and maybe collocates, reading the texts that contain these keywords to work out why they're key and what they've been used to achieve in texts. So to give a brief example of a study, this is one I carried out a few years ago now, about 4 years ago. And I was looking at gender, sexuality, and I was particularly interested in looking at the way that people present themselves when they're looking for relationships. And this is part of a series of studies where I've looked at how people present themselves in relationships. And I looked at some studies involving men's adverts in the past. And so I thought, often when I do research on gender, I end up comparing men and women together. And I thought, actually, sometimes it's actually nice just to focus just on one group rather than always doing this comparison. So I thought, for this study, I want to just look at women, put men to one side, I've looked at them before, and look at how women talk about relationships and the kind of things they want to get out of a relationship. So I found a website called Craigslist, which has a free personal advertising section. You can post adverts depending on the location that you're in, your gender, and the gender of the person that you're looking for. So I collected about 400 adverts, not very many, but the adverts were quite repetitive. They used similar kinds of language. So you don't need a lot of text if you're looking at quite a restricted form of language like this. I just focused on American women, and I classified them into two groups. There are adverts where women were seeking men as a partner, and then there were some adverts where women were seeking other women as a partner. So I've got two subcorpora here. And I thought it would be interesting to kind of compare these together, to see what the differences were. So I used the keywords technique, comparing the first set against the second, and then vice versa, to get two sets of keywords. And that's those words in the table there. So the first column is showing us the keywords in the women seeking men, and the second column is the keywords for the women seeking women. And I've just put the top 25 keywords there, the ones that have the strongest significance for the typical data set. Now, I talked about so what findings a bit earlier on, kind of non about obvious findings, and you can look down these, and some of these words actually are very obvious. You'd probably, if I asked you to guess what women who were looking for men would use, you'd probably guess some of these words. So the top one, for example, is man, and then the second one is guy. And then we have words like gentleman, his, male, and so on. So women seeking men talk about men, and that's not really a very exciting finding, is it? So I won't spend too much time on that. In a similar way, on the left of the table, women seeking women have words like ladies, women, girls, female, etc. Although look at line 19, you have men there. I'll come back to that in a bit. But what I'm going to do is focus on maybe the less obvious keywords, the ones where I wasn't sure what was happening. So I'm going to look at the pronoun me, which is the third top keyword for women seeking women. I often find pronouns very interesting to look at. They always have something interesting to tell me, even though they seem to be quite insignificant small words, but they often can be very interesting from an ideological point of view to examine. So I look at me, and I'm also going to look at the word we for the women seeking women, and that's the 24th most significant keyword right at the bottom of the table. And I'm also going to look at the word no, which is the second strongest keyword for women seeking women as well. So they're all grammatical words, and I couldn't really, looking at the table, I couldn't really guess at why they might be there. And that's often where the interesting findings come, when you don't know why a word appears in a corpus. So let's look at the word me first. So this is a keyword for women who are seeking men. They use the word me a lot more than women seeking women. And here's my summary of the patterns around this word, which was based upon doing a more detailed concordance analysis. So first of all, I found 16 cases of these women where me was used as a way of introducing the advertiser. They were signaling that they were going to give a description of themselves. So these occur in cases like, as for me, I'm a young woman who's a little lost, or about me, 29, never married, etc. But this was actually a minority pattern. Only 5.5% of cases of me were used in this kind of introducing yourself presentation. The majority pattern in 83% of cases was used where the advertiser puts themselves in the grammatical patient position, and then the male comes in the subject position, or the agent. So cases like, I just want someone who can make me happy. I love people who can make me laugh, know when it's time to be serious and a gentleman, touch me and trust me, savory sensation, looking for someone to show me around town, looking for a handsome, professional, well-off gentleman who will make me feel like a woman. So in these cases, the advertiser is telling the potential men who might reply to her what she wants to happen. And in case of agency, grammatical agency, this is very interesting. These women are saying what they want to happen to them, but they're positioning themselves grammatically as the recipient of a hypothetical man's actions. So they're being acted upon rather than doing the acting themselves. And I think that's very interesting in terms of how it positions women in terms of power and their relationship with other people. The other set of advertisers, the women who were looking for women, rarely used me at all. And when they did, they rarely used it in this particular construction, which is kind of implying that, these women are seeing men as more dominant. They're the ones who are doing the actions, and the women are kind of receiving the actions from them. So that's a notable difference in the ways that advertisers express themselves. Okay, looking at women who are seeking women, Rather than using me, these women used we a lot more. And this relates to stating a kind of desire of the relationship you'd like to have. So one poster says, maybe we could do happy hour or find a good Taco Tuesday spot. Another one says, if you enjoy long walks at the beach, chivalrous behavior and sincerity, perhaps we should chat. So this is more indicative of a shared activity with both participants doing the same thing at the same time, rather than one person doing something to the other. The implicature here is grammatical equality. We can motivate each other at the gym, we can make dinner together. Now, we also implies, though, that the reader has already mentally created a picture of this bonded relationship with this person they've never met yet. And various people have written about how the word we has cultural significance, in that it means a relationship has become serious. When you start using we to your friends about the person you're with, it means that you're in a proper relationship. And there are, examples of this. There's an online article called Going Plural, Making the Jump from Me to We. There's a book called When I Becomes We, Together as One. So we has this cultural significance. And the women who are looking for other women are much more likely to use we right from the beginning, even before they've met their relationship partner. Whereas the women seeking men don't use we hardly at all. And they certainly don't use it in this kind of context. So I won't say too much about why that's the case, but in the paper I published on this, I tried to relate it to different kinds of expectations and roles that reflect different gender discourses in society. The idea that men are the actors and women are the acted upon. And these are not just circulated by men, but in some contexts, in more subtle ways, they get circulated by women too. So I want to now look at the keyword no, which was a keyword in the women seeking women adverts. And it was the second strongest keyword that they used. It occurred 169 times. Most of the time it occurs before a noun phrase and used to specify the kinds of people the advertiser does not want to meet. And the most frequent of these by far was no men, which explains also why men was a keyword for the women seeking women. And it was that strange one that didn't seem to fit in with the pattern. And I just put a few examples there to give you some illustrations of how they use these phrases like no men. And they're very emphatic, as you can see. That first one has, I think, 10 cases of the word no before they use men. It's in block caps as well for emphasis, and there's 4 exclamation marks afterwards as well. The next one also has block caps, please no men, with 3 exclamation marks. These advertisers really, really do not want to meet men. And in order to explain why these women are using this quite extreme form of language, let's look at the third and fourth examples here. So the third one says, let's talk on the phone for details. Tired of men answering my profile. I can prove I'm a woman, can you? So she's explicitly noting that men are writing to her, despite the fact that her advert is in the section for women seeking women of this website. And she's actually also suggesting that some posters might be impersonating women, but actually they're men. Now, the last one that I had here, I actually collected it and then I actually removed it from my corpus because I thought this is actually in the wrong section. It's actually a man writing, but it's actually useful to look at it again here to see, it helps to explain why women are referring to no men so much. So this is a man writing saying, I know this is the woman for women section, but bi and lesbian girls tend to be open-minded. So there's clearly evidence that women seeking women tend to get unwanted messages when they're looking for relationships from men, which they find very annoying. Now, on the other hand, I didn't find any evidence that women seeking men got unwanted or inappropriate messages. And in the past, when I've looked at male adverts, men also have never complained that they've got unwanted adverts as well. It's only in this one specific case, which again is quite interesting and suggests an inequality in terms of experiences of people and the expectations that they might have about who's going to answer their adverts. So from a critical perspective, while this corpus included adverts written by women, it shows me that female identity gets positioned in relationship to men. It's like it's very hard for women to get away from men. And when I did this research, I wanted to not focus on men and just look at women, but oddly, men kept coming in to the analysis in different ways. So the women who were looking for men position themselves as the grammatical recipient of male actions. The women who are looking for other women get bothered by men who want to get in touch with them. So it's kind of an interesting study. Again, I wasn't expecting to find any of this, but the focus kept coming back to men all the time, even though it's something I tried not to focus on in the analysis. Okay, the final short example I want to talk about involves using techniques that are associated more with CDA or critical discourse analysis. And these consider context in more detail. And I've authored a paper, co-authored a paper with Ruth Vodak, Tony McHenry, and others, which talks about combining CDA and corpus linguistics together and how to shift between them. And the final example today I've got focuses on one part of that model, which is looking at the sort of more context-based CDA aspect of analysis. And this is intertextuality. So intertextuality involves referring to one text within another text. And it can sometimes just mean mentioning the name of another text. So if I write Baker et al. 2008, that's intertextuality going on now, I'm referencing the text. But it can mean reproducing part of a text, referencing or quoting a text, maybe changing the text a bit by paraphrasing it or parodying it in some way. Can be quite hard, I think, to spot if you're doing a corpus analysis, because you don't necessarily know that something is an intertextual case unless you have the same text occurring twice in different bits of the corpus, and that might come up in your analysis. So sometimes you have to rely on hunches and guesswork, and that's what I had to do really with this study. But it actually was quite a productive part of the analysis. So this is my other book, which came out actually a couple of weeks ago, and I've been tweeting about it this week. So this is a book called Obesity in the News, Language and Representation in the Press. And I co-authored it with Gavin Brooks, who's also at Lancaster. So this is a newspaper representation study. We collected 36 million words of newspaper articles that contained either the words obese or obesity between the years 2008 and 2017. And for analysis, we looked at different approaches. We thought we'd look at how men and women represented differently in the articles, how people wrote about social class in relationship to obesity as well. So we looked at terms like middle class and working class. We also looked at change over time, and we also compared differences between different newspapers. And it's this last question, differences between newspapers, that I want to focus on very briefly here in this talk. So one thing that we did was we got keywords associated with each newspaper by comparing every newspaper against the remainder of the corpus. So we compared, say, The Guardian against the other 10 newspapers that we had as a kind of reference corpus to see what the keywords in The Guardian were. And I'm going to just focus on one newspaper, which is the Daily Mirror, which is a newspaper that my father used to read when I was growing up, so I'm quite familiar with it. And this is a tabloid newspaper, and it's politically affiliated with a kind of left of centre position. And these were the keywords that we got when we compared the Daily Mirror against all of the other 10 newspapers. You can see there's a lot of first person pronouns there, and you know already that I like pronouns. So we've got things like I, me, myself, and my. And often the Mirror is using narratives, first person narratives in articles about obesity, which is a bit unusual for newspaper reporting. So that was kind of interesting. We've also got female pronouns like she and her, phrases like mum of two, things like that, and mum. So tended to be more of a kind of a female kind of slant to these articles as well. And when we looked at these keywords in more detail, we found that they were often used in narratives about people's weight loss. And that explains why we have keywords like transformation, incredible, amazing, and lost. So these are stories where people, ordinary people, talking about how they used to be have very high weight, and then they went on a diet or had gastric surgery or something, and then they lost a lot of weight, and now they look amazing and they're happy. And there were often photographs in these articles of the before and after. I'm sure you've seen these kinds of stories yourself as well, and they're kind of inspirational. One thing they don't tend to talk about is that it's actually not a good idea to lose a lot of weight very quickly. And often what happens when people do lose a lot of weight very quickly is that they often put it back on again in a year or so. And sometimes they put even more weight on than they'd lost in the first place. So these narratives are actually maybe only half of the story. They're kind of telling the happy ending, but it's actually more like the happy halfway point, and then there's a kind of a sadder ending to come a bit later on. And I want to focus on one of these keywords, and it's the keyword slimming, which occurred 540 times in the Daily Mirror. And when I looked at the context that slimming occurred in, 63% of the time it occurred in the phrase Slimming World. Now, Slimming World is an organization where you sign up to join, and then you have to pay a weekly subscription fee. And then as a result of that, you get advice on how to lose weight. You get these kind of weight loss management programs with diets, and it tells you what to eat at certain times of the day and things like that. So when the newspaper mentions Swimming World, it's usually as part of these inspirational weight loss narratives, where the person talks about how they were very, very overweight, and then they joined Swimming World, and then suddenly they lost a lot of weight, and that changed their life, and now they're happy. And so I just put an example there off to the left. This is from a Mirror article from 18th of March 2016. It's about a married couple called Andrew and Paula Butler, and their story begins when they were on a dream holiday to Dubai, and they struggled to fasten the seatbelts on the plane because they were overweight. And then their sister Diane, who was a member of Slimming World already, she recommended the group to them, and they joined, and they lost so much weight that they were named Slimming World's Couple of the Year. And I thought this was an interesting story because there were so many stories like this in the Mirror. They all mentioned Slimming World as the thing which changed people's lives. And I thought, isn't that wonderful? Slimming World must be this amazing kind of organization. But I thought it was also interesting that none of the other newspapers talked about Slimming World very much. So it seemed a bit strange. And I had a hunch that maybe something interesting was happening. So I copied and pasted a few of the lines of the article that you can see there. And I just copied them into Google and pressed search. And guess what? One of the first links that came up was a link to Slimming World's website. And here it is. It was exactly the same story that Slimming World had published on their website on the same day that came out of the Mirror. So it's the story about Andrew and Paula Butler, their dream holiday to Dubai, how their sister Diane recommended Slimming World to them, and now the Slimming World's Couple of the Year. So the Mirror's support and advocacy of Slimming World could be seen as a good thing. It's urging readers to participate in a community. They can share their stories, they can make friends, they can get advice from others. Practices that are very much in line with the Mirror's left-leaning ideological perspective, which values participating in a cooperative community that has shared goals. But bear in mind that you have to pay to join this community. There's a weekly membership fee. Somebody is making money from this. So this indicates that there are more neoliberal aspects of this membership, and these are wrapped up in the commercial profit-making objectives of the organization. And the way that the Mirror writes about Slimming World feels like a mixture between an article and an advert. It's what Zhao calls an advertorial. And it suggests that slimming is framed as falling within commercial concerns. On the Mirror's website, many of its weight loss stories are actually filed in a section called Slimming World, and that's part of a larger section called Lifestyle. But I wondered if a casual reader of the newspaper, particularly if you bought the print version of the paper from a shop, maybe they're not going to be aware that what they're actually reading is not impartial journalism, it's not unbiased journalism, but it's a story that's been reproduced and copied from a commercial text, from basically an advert. And this blurring of the line between the advert and news can I think be quite problematic. So this is a case of intertextuality. The Mirror is copying something from a Slimming World article or vice versa, although this isn't really made very clear in the newspaper. It was only by following up this hunch, by Googling the article, that I was able to identify the journalistic practice which raises questions about who's benefiting from the people who are reading these kinds of inspirational stories and then go on to sign up to pay to have their Slimming World membership. Okay, to end with some concluding points. It could be argued that the combination of corpus approaches to carry out discourse analysis is going to mean twice as many problems, twice as many difficulties, because we're combining two approaches together. But I'd like to see this more optimistically as it giving us twice as many strengths. It's still a very much a developing field, and there are few standards and very few set ways of doing things. We're still kind of learning our way, feeling our way around in the dark, I think. But again, we could maybe see this as an opportunity to give us the chance for new researchers to make their mark in the field and to develop new ideas. Ultimately, we are tied to the corpus software that we have, and otherwise the software becomes more sophisticated, such as Sketch Engine, the kind of analysis that we can do can also become more advanced and detailed. But we shouldn't assume that the software can replace human analysis. The software can make our analysis quicker and easier and more accurate, but hopefully, as I've shown, humans are needed at very much every stage of this kind of research in order to make sense of the patterns that we're finding. So thank you ever so much for listening to me. I've got some suggestions there for further reading and some of the references that I mentioned today as well. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and then sort of come back to you so I can see you all and then hopefully answer some questions if you have any. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Paul, for your wonderful talk. I hope this will be beneficial for corpus approaches to discourse analysis and the corpus approaches to social issues as well. Okay, now we can take question answers. We have few questions here. Okay, can you see question answers?
I can. Should I go to the question and answer button and see if I can see the questions?
Q&A.
Let's put my glasses on to read this, I'm afraid. Can I recommend, so I'll start at the top and work, see how fast I can go down. Okay.
Okay, there are many questions, so you may take few.
Yeah, I'll go down to the ones that I feel I can answer. Yes. Could I recommend books which detail the four models: description, interpretation, explanation, and evaluation of CADs? So in the, yeah, there's I think the book Using Corpora to Analyze Gender, I think talks about that. I think possibly quite a bit. So that might be a good one to try to find. Isn't the word violent with the word jihad an example of a biased approach towards critical Islamic ideology? That's a really interesting question. We struggled a lot with this book and the title that we were going to call it. One thing we wanted to make very, very clear in this book that we were not trying to kind of paint Islam as a negative religion. That's the opposite of what I believe. And the other research that I've done looking at representations of Islam in the press, has tried to point out where people are biased against Islam and Muslims, and that's something that I feel very strongly about. So, this was research that we were asked to do, and we thought about the potential implications of doing it and how that would cast us. So this is exactly the kind of question that I was dreading to see, because it's the thing that I didn't want to have. We didn't want to have the word Islam in the title of the book, or Muslims at all. And we also spent a lot of time in the book looking at the word jihad and looking at how it was used in the book and talking about how jihad means different things within Islam. And it can just mean simply struggle. And there are versions of jihad which can involve, say, writing a letter of complaint to a newspaper which is posting Islamophobic things. So there are lots of ways of performing jihad. So when we talked about jihad, we wanted to make clear that it wasn't jihad fully, but it was jihad that just related to violent cases. Now, unfortunately, that ends up sort of having a collocation of violence and jihad together. It's only one case, and we were trying to be as specific as we could, rather than saying all jihad is bad, because I don't believe that at all. I believe that the interpretation of jihad, which is used by these text writers, is their interpretation. It's not one that I particularly agree with, and I know it's one that many Muslims that I've spoken to don't agree with either. So that is a kind of sense of how we were trying to use that word. But it's one of those things where how do you talk about a topic without trying to appear that you're being critical? Hopefully, in the book, when you read the book, we do talk a lot about how we're not critical of Islam and its ideology, but we're focusing on a very, very small number of people who have this, what I view as a very skewed interpretation, which has damaging consequences, not just for Western people or non-Muslims, but for many Muslims as well, I think as well. So I hope that's something that would come across if you were to read the book. Can you tell us some tools for CA? I'm not sure what you mean by CA. Do you mean discourse analysis or CADs? CA usually stands for conversation analysis. But I'm guessing maybe you don't mean that, because that would be a different talk. Tools.
Conversation analysis, I guess.
Conversation analysis. Oh, well, I don't do conversation analysis, so maybe you need to ask somebody like Charles Antorki or Elizabeth Stokoe rather than me for that question. As far as I know about CA, it's something which is not done with a computational tool. You might want to use that in vivo, perhaps, but from what I do remember from my master's degree, I did it by transcribing the data and then analyzing it by hand. Maybe things have advanced since then, but tools for corpus linguistics, I'd say we have Sketch Engine, we have a very nice one called Lanxbox, which helps you to create collocational networks, which is quite an advanced tool. There's also another one at Lancaster called CQP Web, which is an online-based tool, which is very fast and lets you look at lots of data. There's AntConc, which is one I recommend to people who are maybe starting out, because it's a free tool. It's quite an easy one to understand how to use. So you can download all of these from the web or find them on websites. It's called AntConc, ANTCONC. And there's another one called Wordsmith, which also is a little bit more sophisticated, although you have to pay for that. But I think you can download version 4 for free. So, and then a final one I'll mention is WMatrix, which is again at Lancaster. It's a web-based tool. You have to sign up for an account. But the nice thing about that is it does grammatical tagging, and it does semantic tagging of the corpus as well. So that can be quite a helpful thing. Which corpus tool is reliable for identifying thematic trends? Well, I'd say probably WMatrix is pretty good for that, because it does do the semantic tagging, and then it will give you the semantic tags which are actually key in your data, and they can help you to identify these thematic trends. But I'd always say that when you're using tagging, it's always useful to go and check with the coding and then look at the concordance lines to make sure that if something has been coded as something, that it actually is what the code is claiming to be. So for example, the word like honey may get coded by a tagger as food, but if you actually look at how it's used in the corpus, it may be used as a kind of term of endearment, someone saying, oh, you know, honey, I love you, things like that. So you always have to be a bit careful about the ways that words are used and the ways that they're used in taggers. Okay, let's look a bit further down. So as we say, corpus linguistics is a methodology, involves computer-based empirical examples, analysis of naturally occurring and spoken written text. Please explain its use in C/DA. Yes, so CDA, you know, is a method, as an approach to analysis, which focuses on how language is used in order to create unequal relationships and represent people, and in order to persuade people. All like corpus linguistics is doing is really helping you to do the analysis by helping you to make sense of patterns in very large amounts of data. That would be very difficult, I think, to do by hand. It would take a long time, and you'd probably end up making mistakes as well. So the corpus approach is really just going to tell you, what's frequent in the data, or what's more frequent than expected, so it ends up being unusually frequent. And those are things that maybe you wouldn't spot yourself with the human eye, and they help to give you a focus. And they also help to remove maybe a bit of your own bias, because with the computer approach, you don't really know what you're going to find in advance, and then you have to explain patterns and the frequencies that the computer program tells you about. And that is one of the kind of problems, I think, with doing a traditional CDA, in that you're always having to sort of check your own biases and make sure that you're not just finding things that you're expecting to see. With the corpus approach, you find things that you didn't expect to see. And I think that's what makes the analysis much more convincing and stronger. Okay, next question. How many word sketches did I run for the bar graph about America? 3. So I did one for the extreme data, one for the fringe, and then one for the moderate. And then I had to get the frequencies for each one. And it took quite a long time, and Sketch Engine did help me to do it. I think if I just done it using a normal corpus tool like AntConc, it would have taken ages to do all those categorizations. But having them categorized in terms of the grammatical functions really helped me to spot those representations a lot more quickly, and saved a lot of time. Okay, next question. How CADs can be used for analysis of visual features of images? This is a very good question. And it's a challenging question, and I think one that we're still kind of engaging with. So I talked at the end about how the field is still developing, and I feel like there is still a lot of work that needs to be done here in terms of analyzing visual features. When I have seen people do it, what they've tended to do is, look at it, do it by hand. So they've kind of combined a visual analysis maybe of samples of data in their corpus with a corpus analysis of just the text, which is not perfect, I think. One thing I did recently, going back to the study on newspapers, is I was quite interested in looking at the language which occurred with images in these newspaper articles about obesity. And I created a very basic categorization scheme, which was based upon, can you see a person in the image? Are they overweight? And can you see their face or not? Because often, I don't know if you have seen articles in the news about obesity, but what they often do is they show a picture of someone who's overweight, and often they either kind of chop their head off so you can't see their head, or they'll do a picture, photograph them from behind so you can see their back, but you can't see their face. So I was interested in what the language is like when you can see their face, and what the language looks like when you can't see their face. And it was quite interesting. So when you can't, so I tagged my data, the images there where you could see the face, I put in one corpus. The images had articles where you can see their face, I put in another corpus. So I had 2 corpora. And then I did a keywords comparison against both. And I found that when you can't see their face, there's a lot more reference to death in these articles about obesity and terrible health conditions and things like that. So, you know, that's just a very basic example of one thing that came out here, where there's this kind of sort of idea that, you know, obesity is framed around mortality and death, and when they do that, they don't want to show people's faces. So there are much more negative articles there, I think, and sort of anonymizing, and in a sense, I think dehumanizing at the same time by not showing faces. Okay, please.
I'm afraid we can have one last question.
Sure. One last question. I know I could go on and on, couldn't I? I'm so sorry. I'm seeing 57 messages, so I'll just go down.
The most of the questions are quite general.
I know they are, yeah.
Very hard to find very specific questions.
I wonder if the text that you analysed in relation to jihad were in Arabic or another language, and how did you make the conclusion America was feminized? The texts were originally in Arabic and translated. No, the texts were in English, actually. They were found, there were the people who kind of committed the violence were British citizens, many whom, you know, did not have full understanding of Arabic, and they may have known a bit of it. And the text did include some Arabic, but very small amounts of Arabic were used. And I think the Arabic, in a sense, was used as a kind of legitimation strategy, possibly, that, you know, in order to sort of say, you know, we're good Muslims because we know Arabic, even though, you know, that could be a questionable statement. So the texts were in English initially, and that's how it was quite easy to kind of figure out that they were, you know, using words like she and her, because that would be the original versions of them. So yeah, that was quite an easy one. Okay, I think I'll stop answering questions now.
What about, Professor Baker, environmental issues, such as global warming and the other issues of related to environment, this new campaigns that we have? What about the corpus approaches? What are the future prospects that we all can do about that?
For global warming?
Yeah, like issues of environment, such as global warming.
Yeah, I think there is potentially things we can look at. I mean, I think, you know, one thing is looking, and this is work which has, you know, happened at Lancaster with other people, is looking at, say, news reporting around global warming, looking at how different newspapers report on, you know, is global warming something which is actually happening or not? And, you know, different newspapers have changed their stance over time. Or if you can do a cross-cultural study, maybe look at a country like Brazil, which has had a you know, kind of where people there tend to believe in global warming much more, and compare that maybe against other countries where maybe they don't believe in global warming. You know, that could potentially be quite interesting, looking at the language which is used in order to persuade people of the existence of global warming and also the importance of doing something about it. You know, looking at phrases like climate change versus climate crisis. I know The Guardian is one newspaper which has recently changed the way that it reports. So it used to write about climate change, now it uses climate crisis. So it's kind of using that, I think, in order to persuade people, you know, that this is something which is so important and we have to do something about it now. I think, as well as looking at newspapers, looking at political speeches, I think is incredibly important. Often this data is quite easy to get hold of because speeches get transcribed and they get put in repositories on websites. So looking at the political debates around a topic like climate change or global warming, and looking at how people argue from different positions politically and to justify. Also looking, say, at corporate of large businesses who produce reports on what they are doing, to combat climate change, and often they present themselves in an extremely positive way. And language, I think, can be part of that self-presentation. But when you actually maybe look at what they actually have done, sometimes it's not as convincing as the way that they're presenting themselves. So those, I think, 3 very important text types that could be used, I think, when looking at climate change.
Thank you, Professor Becker. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
We had a wonderful session, very interactive in a sense that we had questions also from participants. Definitely, there's still many questions left. We cannot address all the questions in this short period of time. But we are very thankful to Professor Becker that he addressed some very important questions that